The envelope landed on the kitchen table like it had been dropped from a great height. Elara Mensah looked at it for a moment without touching it. She had been standing at the counter when Gideon came in, still in his coat, and he had set it down between the salt shaker and the fruit bowl, with a kind of deliberate calm that was worse than anger would have been. She recognized the return address, their family lawyer, the one Gideon had started using 3 months ago, without mentioning it to her. She picked up the envelope, her hands were steady. Outside, the November sky over Ottawa pressed low and gray against the kitchen window. The maple in the backyard had dropped everything. The branches were bare and black against the white of the first frost. Inside the envelope was a single document, 12 pages. At the top of the first page, in clean serif font, were the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Gideon Ashby had filed for divorce. He was still standing by the door, watching her. He hadn't taken his coat off. That detail registered somewhere in the back of her mind. He was ready to leave, had arranged things so he wouldn't have to stay. "When did you file this?" she asked. 3 weeks ago. She turned to the second page. His lawyer's name was printed there. A firm on Spark Street. She had walked past that building 100 times without ever going inside. 3 weeks, she said. "I wanted everything to be in order before I told you." Elara set the papers down. She looked at her husband, at the way he was standing slightly back from her. His weight shifted toward the door, his jaw set in that particular way she had learned to read over 11 years of marriage. He had rehearsed this. He had gone over it in his head, maybe in a bathroom mirror, maybe in the car on the way home, and he had decided that clean and organized was better than honest and messy. He had decided she could be handled. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "I'll need to call someone." And Gideon nodded as though that was the end of the conversation and left. They had met at a conference in Toronto when Elara was 29. She had been there representing the small environmental consulting firm where she worked at the time, a job she had taken to pay off her student debt while she figured out the next thing. Gideon had been presenting a keynote. He was charming in front of a crowd, the kind of man who seemed to fill a room without effort. He had found her afterward at the canapé table and introduced himself as though she hadn't just watched him speak for 40 minutes. She had married him at 32 in a small ceremony outside Kingston. Her mother had flown in from Accra. Gideon's family had driven down from Barrie, his mother Lorraine's, a collection of aunts who all had opinions about the centerpieces. For a while it had been good. Then it had been fine. Then it had been the kind of thing you stopped examining too closely, because you were afraid of what you'd find. Gideon was the kind of man who collected accomplishments the way other people collect furniture. Every new thing he acquired, a promotion, a car, a house with the right postal code, he arranged around himself like evidence of something. Elara had understood this about him early on and had decided it was a manageable quality. She had not understood until much later that she had been one of those things he collected. There was a woman. There had been, she suspected, for about 2 years. Her name was Tessa. Elara had found this out the way women usually find these things out. Not through confrontation but through accumulation. A name mentioned once too casually, a change in the way Gideon checked his phone, a weekend conference that left no expense receipts. She had never said any of it out loud. She had kept working, kept cooking on Sundays, kept showing up to his firm's events in the right dress and the right shoes, kept being the wife he had arranged in the right place in his life. She had been waiting, she realized now, for him to find his nerve. He had finally found it. The call came on a Wednesday morning in December, 6 weeks after Gideon had left the papers on the kitchen table. Elara was at her desk. She worked from home most days now, had for the past 3 years, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, a Montreal area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Miss Elara Mensah?" The voice was formal. A man, older, careful with his words in the way of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes things. "Speaking. My name is Arthur Delacroix. I am the senior partner at Delacroix & Fils, a legal firm in Montreal. I am calling on behalf of the estate of Kofi Mensah." A pause. "I believe he was your grandfather." Elara set down her pen. She had not spoken to anyone on her father's side of the family in almost 15 years. Her grandfather, Kofi Mensah, had been a complicated figure, a man who had built something significant, and then spent the rest of his life being difficult about it. He and her father had a falling out when Elara was a teenager. She had been kept at the edges of all of it, aware of the shape of the argument without ever knowing its contents. She had heard, through her mother, that Kofi had died in October. "I'm aware of his passing," she said. "Then you may be aware that he left a will," Arthur Delacroix said. "What you may not be aware of is that you are named in it as the primary beneficiary." The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Elara said. "Could you say that again?" She flew to Montreal the following week. She had told no one. Not her mother, not her friends, not her lawyer. She had retained one of her own by then, a woman named Christine Okafor, who had an office near the University of Ottawa and the kind of measured precision that Elara had found immediately reassuring. She had not told Gideon. She sat across from Arthur Delacroix in a boardroom on the 22nd floor of a building in Old Montreal, with the St. Lawrence visible through the window in the gray December light, and listened to him explain what her grandfather had built. Kofi Mensah had emigrated from Ghana in 1971. He had arrived in Montreal with almost nothing, and had spent the next 5 decades building a real estate development company that now held properties across 4 provinces, and managed an investment portfolio that Arthur Delacroix described, with practiced understatement, as substantial. He had never gone public. He had never taken partners. He had run his company with absolute control and absolute privacy for 50 years. He had 2 children, Elara's father Emmanuel and a daughter Abina who had died in 2009. Emmanuel had 3 children. Elara was the eldest. In his will, Kofi had left his company and the majority of his estate to Elara. Not to Emmanuel, not split between the grandchildren, to Elara specifically, with a letter attached that Arthur Delacroix slid across the table in a sealed envelope. She opened it later, alone in her hotel room. Her grandfather's handwriting was small and precise. The letter was 2 pages. He wrote about watching her from a distance, through her mother's occasional updates, through things Emmanuel had let slip without realizing. He wrote that he had seen in her, from the time she was small, the same quality he recognized in himself. A refusal to make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort. He wrote that he had made mistakes with Emmanuel, and with Abina, and with people he had loved, and that he did not expect forgiveness for any of it, but that he had spent the last years of his life putting his affairs in order, and that putting them in order meant leaving what he had built to the person he believed would not diminish it. I know you have had to manage people's assumptions about you for a long time, he wrote. I hope that what I am leaving you makes that easier. Elara sat on the edge of the hotel bed and held the letter for a long time. She did not cry then either. But it was a different kind of not crying. It was the kind that takes effort. Christine Okafor had a way of looking at documents that made Elara feel like everything was going to be handled correctly. She would spread papers across her desk and move through them with a pen in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, pausing occasionally to circle something or make a note in the margin, and the whole process had a deliberateness that Elara found steadying. So, Christine said on a Thursday morning in January, let's talk about the divorce proceeding. Gideon's lawyer filed for standard division of matrimonial assets. They've identified the house, both vehicles, your joint accounts, and his pension. Christine looked up. They have not yet requested full financial disclosure from you, because they assume I don't have anything significant to disclose. Correct. Christine set her pen down. They submitted a disclosure request for your employment income and the value of your consulting business. They are estimating your net worth at somewhere around $140,000. Elara nodded. They are going to need to revise that estimate, Christine said. The transfer of the estate had taken several weeks to process through the legal channels. Arthur Delacroix's firm was meticulous, but it had been completed. Elara was now on paper and in practice the owner of Mensah Property Group and the primary holder of her grandfather's investment portfolio. The revised number was not $140,000. It was not in the hundreds of thousands at all. Christine had reviewed the full valuation with her the week before, going through the line items with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. Elara had listened and had found, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had stopped being surprised and started trying to understand what this meant for the rest of her life. I want to be clear, Elara said now. I am not trying to punish him. I want a clean separation. I understand that. Christine picked up her pen again. But I want you to understand something. When Gideon's lawyer realizes what your actual financial position is, things are going to change. The tone of this proceeding is going to change. I know. He may try to claim a share of the inheritance. We'll fight that. Inheritances are generally excluded from the matrimonial pool under Ontario law, particularly when they were received after the date of separation, which in your case is clear. But he's going to try. Elara looked out the window. The street below was full of people in heavy coats moving through the January cold. Let him try, she said. The day Gideon found out was not a day Elara was present for. Christine had told her it was better that way. What she learned afterward, from Christine's account of the meeting, was this. Gideon's lawyer, a man named Fletcher, which Elara noted with a private piece of irony since she had been told never to use that name, had arrived for a disclosure exchange meeting expecting a routine session. Christine had provided Elara's full financial disclosure at the start of the meeting without preamble. There was a silence, according to Christine, that lasted almost 2 minutes. Fletcher had asked for a recess. When they came back, Gideon, who had been waiting in an adjacent room, had been brought in. This was unusual. Lawyers generally managed these exchanges without their clients present. But Fletcher had apparently decided that this required a conversation. Gideon, Christine told her, had looked at the documents for a long time. He had asked several questions. Fletcher had answered most of them in a low voice, At one point Gideon had set the papers down and looked at the ceiling. Christine had said nothing throughout. She had waited. Finally Gideon had said, "I didn't know," and Christine had said evenly, "No, you didn't." It was Gideon's mother, Lorraine, who called first. Elara was in the kitchen when her phone rang. It was a Sunday morning. She had been making tea and watching the cardinals that occasionally visited the feeder she'd put up in the backyard, and she almost didn't answer because she saw Lorraine's name on the screen, and she wasn't sure she had the patience for it. She answered anyway. Lorraine's voice had a quality Elara had always found difficult. It was warm on the surface and something else underneath, the way a river looks calm before you check the current. She had always been polite to Elara. She had also always made it clear in ways she never said directly that she had imagined something different for her son. "I heard," Lorraine said after a few pleasantries that neither of them meant. "About your grandfather, did you? Gideon told me." A pause. "He's very upset, Elara. He feels like you hid something from him." Elara carried her mug to the window. The cardinals were gone. The feeder turned slightly in the wind. "I didn't hide anything," she said. "I received an inheritance after we separated. After he filed for divorce." "Still," Lorraine said. "In a marriage you share things." "He filed the papers in October, Lorraine. We weren't in a marriage at that point. He made that decision." There was a pause. Lorraine recalibrated. "He made a mistake," she said. "He knows that. He's been trying to reach you." "I know. I've asked him to communicate through our lawyers, Elara." Lorraine's voice shifted into something more direct. "He wants to talk to you. Just talk. He's not asking to undo anything. He thinks if you could sit down together." "No." The word came out without heat, just a clean, flat syllable. "Lorraine," Elara said. "Gideon made a choice. He made it very carefully. He had papers prepared. He had a lawyer. He waited until everything was in order. He made his choice the same way he makes every choice, which is methodically, and only after he's decided what the outcome should be." She paused. "I'm doing the same thing now." Lorraine was quiet. "I hope you have a good Sunday," Elara said, and she hung up. The offices of Mensah Property Group were in a building in Westmount that Elara had visited twice in the month since the transfer, learning the shape of what she had inherited. The executive team, people who had been working for Kofi for decades, who had been informed of the transition with the same understatement that characterized everything in Arthur Delacroix's world, had received her with a wariness she found entirely reasonable. She was 41 years old. She had a background in environmental consulting. She had never run a company of this scale. What she had was her grandfather's letter, and a clarity about what she was trying to do, and Christine Okafor's steady presence in any meeting that required legal guidance. The CFO was a man named Bernard, who had been with the company for 18 years, and who had looked at her across the boardroom table in their first real working session and said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And Elara had said, "Not entirely, but I'm going to learn, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Something shifted in his expression at that. Not warmth exactly, but respect maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. She had kept all of Kofi's senior staff. She had spent 3 months reading every document she could find, asking questions without embarrassment, making mistakes in small enough contexts that they could be corrected. She had hired 2 additional people, a communications director and an operations manager, both of whom came with recommendations from companies she had researched. She worked long days and she slept adequately, and she called her mother every Sunday. She did not think about Gideon very much. This surprised her at first. Then it didn't. The divorce was finalized in March. Christine called her with the news on a Tuesday afternoon. The asset division had been settled. The house had been sold and the proceeds divided. The joint accounts had been split. Gideon had retained his firm's pension and his personal investments. Elara had retained her inheritance untouched as Christine had promised. Gideon's lawyer had attempted 3 times to argue that the inheritance should be considered a matrimonial asset, and 3 times Christine had closed that argument with the same set of clear, documented facts. The date of separation was established. The date of the inheritance transfer was established. The law was the law. "It's done," Christine said. Elara was at her desk in the Westmount office. Through the window she could see the street below, the gray Montreal sky beginning to show the very first suggestion of spring. A bare tree outside the building had a single bud on one of its upper branches. She could just barely make it out. "Thank you," she said. "You did well," Christine said. "You were patient. That's harder than people think." After she hung up, Elara sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. 11 years. A house in Ottawa. 2 cars, a joint account, a set of dishes they had picked out together at a store in the Glebe on a Saturday afternoon when they were still new to each other. A version of a life that had been assembled piece by piece and had looked, from the outside, exactly the way Gideon had wanted it to look. She thought about the kitchen table, the envelope, his coat still on. She thought about her grandfather writing 2 careful pages in small handwriting to a granddaughter he had never properly known, trying to say what he had seen in her from a distance. A refusal to make herself smaller. Outside, the bud on the bare tree was very small and very sure of itself. She heard about Gideon through mutual friends, the way these things always travel, in fragments and at a remove. He had sold the house quickly, had taken a new position at a firm in Calgary. Tessa, she heard, had ended things not long after the disclosure meeting. This information arrived without drama and registered without satisfaction. It was simply what had happened. Her mother came to visit in April, flying in from Accra for 2 weeks. She was a small, precise woman named Abina. Named Elara now knew, after her great-aunt, who had opinions about everything and shared most of them freely. She walked through the apartment Elara had rented in Westmount and examined it with the thorough attention she brought to anything her daughter had acquired. "It's a good space," she said finally, which from her mother was significant praise. They had dinner together every night of the visit. Elara cooked sometimes and they went out sometimes. And on the nights they went out, her mother dressed with a formality that Elara found both funny and moving. On the last night, over wine at a restaurant on Sherbrooke, her mother said, "Your grandfather would have liked to know you, the real you, not from a distance." "I know," Elara said. "He made a lot of mistakes." Her mother turned her wine glass slowly. "But he saw something true." Elara thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to be seen correctly by someone who never quite found their way to you in time. About the strange gift of it, partial, imperfect, arriving late. "He did," she said. The spring board meeting of Mensah Property Group was attended by 14 people. Elara sat at the head of the table, her grandfather's chair, a detail that had not escaped anyone in the room, and that she had decided to simply inhabit without making a thing of it, and went through the agenda with Bernard at her left and the communications director at her right. And when there was a question she didn't know the answer to, she said so and asked who did. And when there was a decision that needed to be made, she made it. Afterward, Bernard walked with her to the elevator. "Good meeting," he said. He didn't elaborate, but she had learned by now that he didn't elaborate when he meant something. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She thought, as she descended, about the woman who had stood in a kitchen in Ottawa in November and looked at a document on a kitchen table and held herself very still. She thought about all the years of being arranged in the correct place in someone else's life. About learning to be small enough not to disturb anything. She thought about what it felt like to take up exactly the space you were meant to take up. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the lobby. Outside, through the glass front of the building, the Montreal afternoon was bright and cold and full of people, the street glossy with the last of the April rain. Elara walked out into it. She did not look back at the building. She already knew it was there.